There is a quiet assumption embedded in the modern mind. It goes something like this: that the flush of a toilet, the gurgle of a drain, the invisible journey of waste through pipes and processing plants represents the pinnacle of human achievement. That before porcelain and plumbing, humanity wallowed in filth, ignorant of hygiene, waiting for industrial engineers to rescue them from their own bodies. This assumption is not merely wrong, it is dangerously naive. The civilizations that came before did not lack sanitation. They built their entire worlds around it. They understood something that modern societies have been allowed to forget. Human waste is not an inconvenience, it is a force. And for most of recorded history, the management of that force determined whether cities thrived or crumbled into plague pits and mass graves. Long before the first clay pipe was fired or the first stone channel carved, humans understood that what leaves the body carries death within it. The earliest settlements show evidence of deliberate separation. Waste pits dug at specific distances from sleeping areas, designated zones where excrement was deposited, covered, abandoned. These were not random choices. They were the first public health measures in human history, encoded not in laws but in behavior, passed down through generations who may not have understood pathogens but understood consequence. The smell of rot, the swarm of flies, the sickness that followed carelessness. These lessons wrote themselves into human instinct long before writing existed at all. In the Stone Age, nomadic bands had an advantage that settled populations would lose. They could move. When waste accumulated, when the ground became foul, they simply left. The landscape absorbed what they discarded, and time erased their presence. But when humans began to stay in one place, to build permanent structures, to grow populations beyond a few dozen, this solution vanished. Suddenly, the question of where waste went became existential, and the answers that emerged were neither primitive nor accidental. The ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro, built over 4,000 years ago in what is now Pakistan, contained a sanitation system that would not be matched in Europe for millennia. Every house connected to a drainage network. Waste flowed through covered channels beneath the streets, directed away from living spaces, collected in soak pits at the edges of the urban grid. This was not luxury. This was survival architecture. The engineers of the Indus Valley understood that density creates danger, that thousands of bodies producing waste in close proximity will poison themselves unless that waste is moved, contained, controlled. They built their city around this truth. The streets were not designed for commerce or parade. They were designed for drainage. The same principle appears across the ancient world, in variations shaped by climate, material, and belief. In Mesopotamia, the great cities of Ur and Babylon featured terracotta pipes that carried waste from wealthy households to cesspits beyond the walls. The poor had no such luxury. They used communal pits, open trenches, or simply the streets. This was not oversight. It was hierarchy made visible through sanitation. Where waste went, who touched it, who lived near it, who was forced to smell it. These distinctions reinforced the structure of society as surely as temples or palaces. Waste management was never neutral. It was always political. The Egyptians approached the problem with characteristic precision. In the workers' villages near the Great Pyramids, archaeologists have found evidence of organized latrine systems. Stone seats positioned over channels, sand and ash used as absorbent material, regular cleaning schedules implied by the layers of accumulated sediment. The laborers who built monuments to eternity were themselves protected by mundane systems of waste removal. Perhaps the architects understood that disease among workers would slow construction. Perhaps there was genuine concern for welfare. Either way, the result was the same. Organized waste management, extended life, preserved labor, allowed the work to continue. But it is in Rome that the engineering of waste reached its most celebrated and most misunderstood form. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, is often cited as proof of Roman genius. And indeed, it was an impressive system. A massive stone channel that drained the marshes of the Forum, carried rainwater and waste alike to the Tiber River, and kept the center of empire from drowning in its own effluent. But the Cloaca Maxima was not a toilet system. It was a drainage system. Most Romans did not have private latrines connected to. Most Romans used public toilets, communal benches with holes, positioned over flowing water, or simple pits. They shared sponges on sticks to clean themselves. They sat inches apart from strangers, conducting business, sharing gossip, exposed in ways that modern sensibilities find unthinkable. And yet, despite this apparent crudeness, Roman cities functioned. The key was not privacy but flow. Water moved constantly through Roman infrastructure. Aqueducts fed fountains, baths, and latrines. Overflow carried waste away before it could fester. The entire system depended on motion, on the endless circulation of clean water pushing out contamination. When the aqueducts were cut during sieges or invasion, when the water stopped flowing, cities became death traps within weeks. The technology was fragile. It required maintenance, labor, and above all, water. Without these, the Cloaca Maxima became a stagnant tomb, and disease followed. The fall of Roman infrastructure is often discussed in terms of collapsed bridges and crumbling roads. But the true collapse was invisible. It was the failure of drainage systems, the abandonment of public latrines, the return to individual solutions, cesspits dug beneath houses, night soil thrown into streets, rivers transformed into open sewers. Medieval European cities inherited Roman streets without Roman sanitation. They packed populations into dense quarters with no organized waste removal. They created conditions that would breed plague, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery on scales that dwarfed ancient epidemics. The medieval cesspit is an artifact of this failure. Dug beneath houses, sometimes beneath streets, these pits collected household waste for months or years before being emptied by workers known by various names across Europe. Gong farmers, night soilmen, rakers. These were among the lowest members of society, paid poorly for work that shortened their lives through disease and toxic exposure. They worked at night, when the streets were empty, hauling waste beyond city walls to designated dumping grounds. The smell that followed them marked them as untouchable. They were essential and despised. The same paradox that has followed sanitation workers throughout human history. But even in medieval squalor, waste management was not absent. It was failing, inadequate. Overwhelmed by population growth and urban density, cities tried to impose order. Regulations appeared forbidding the dumping of waste in certain streets. Fines were levied against those who allowed their cesspits to overflow. Butchers and tanners, whose trades produced especially noxious waste, were confined to specific districts, usually downriver, downwind, outside the walls if possible. The smell of a city told its story. The wealthy lived uphill, upwind, in quarters where the air was cleaner. The poor clustered in low-lying areas where waste pooled, where disease bred, where death rates were highest. Geography became destiny, and waste drew the map. The Black Death, when it arrived in the 14th century, found European cities perfectly prepared to receive it. Not the plague itself, which was carried by fleas on rats, but the conditions that allowed it to spread with such devastating speed. Streets running with filth, water sources contaminated by human and animal waste, populations weakened by chronic exposure to pathogens. The plague killed perhaps a third of Europe, and while its transmission was not directly linked to human waste, the sanitary conditions of medieval cities ensured that any contagious disease would find easy purchase. The lesson was clear, though centuries would pass before it was truly learned. Density without sanitation is a death sentence waiting to be executed. In other parts of the world, different solutions emerged. In Japan, human waste was not a problem to be hidden, but a resource to be harvested. Night soil collectors paid households for the privilege of removing their waste, which was then transported to agricultural fields and used as fertilizer. The cycle was closed, efficient, and remarkably hygienic by medieval standards. Japanese cities remained cleaner than their European counterparts, in part because waste had economic value. It was not dumped into rivers or left to rot in streets. It was collected, transported, and transformed. The social stigma attached to handling waste existed, but it was tempered by the recognition that this work served essential purposes. China developed similar systems, with elaborate networks of waste collection that fed agricultural production for millennia. The use of human waste as fertilizer, while carrying its own disease risks, prevented the accumulation that made European cities so deadly. It also revealed a different relationship between humans and their excrement. Waste was not merely dangerous, it was powerful. It could grow crops, feed populations, sustain civilization. The taboo was not in the substance itself, but in proximity to it. Those who handled waste were marked, but they were also necessary, and the systems they maintained allowed cities to grow far larger than European equivalent. The question of who handles waste has always been a question of power. In Hindu caste systems, the handling of human excrement was assigned to the lowest caste, a designation that persists in modified forms to this day. In ancient Rome, slaves cleaned the latrines and maintained the sewers. In medieval Europe, the poor and marginalized performed the work that kept cities functional. This was not coincidence, it was design. Waste management requires labor, often dangerous labor, and civilizations have consistently forced this labor onto those with the least power to refuse. The ability to avoid one's own waste, to never see where it goes or who moves it, has always been a marker of status. Invisibility is privilege. The great cholera outbreaks of the 19th century finally forced a reckoning with this invisibility. In London, in Paris, in New York, Thousands died from a disease that spread through contaminated water fouled by the cesspits and sewers that leaked into the same sources people used for drinking. The stench of London in the summer of 1858 became so unbearable that Parliament, meeting beside the reeking Thames, finally authorized the construction of a modern sewer system. They called it the Great Stink, and it accomplished what decades of reformers had failed to achieve. The wealthy could no longer ignore what the poor had always known. The waste was everywhere, and it was killing without discrimination. Joseph Bazalgette's sewers, completed in the following decades, transformed London and became the model for cities worldwide. The principle was simple: contain the waste, move it away from population centers, treat it before releasing it into waterways. This was not new wisdom. It was ancient wisdom, finally applied at scale. The same principles that governed Mohenjo-Daro and the Indus Valley cities applied with industrial technology to industrial populations. The miracle was not the engineering, it was the political will to implement what had always been known. But even modern sanitation carries its own blindness. The flush toilet creates an illusion of disappearance. Waste vanishes instantly, silently, without smell or sight. Where it goes becomes someone else's problem, something that happens far away, in treatment plants and outfall pipes that most people will never see. This invisibility is both a triumph and a vulnerability. It allows urban density on a scale previously impossible. It frees billions from the daily confrontation with their own mortality that waste once represented. But it also severs the connection between action and consequence, between consumption and disposal, between life and its inevitable outputs. The infrastructure that makes this possible is vast, fragile, and aging. Beneath cities around the world, pipes laid a century ago carry waste through systems designed for smaller populations, stressed by development, crumbling from neglect. The workers who maintain these systems remain invisible, their labor essential and undervalued, their exposure to pathogens and toxic gases an accepted cost of modern convenience. The ancient pattern persists. Those with power do not see the waste. Those who handle it bear the burden. The hierarchy written in Roman latrines and medieval cesspits continues in new form. When modern sanitation systems fail, the consequences are immediate and brutal. Natural disasters, infrastructure collapse, war, all create conditions where waste accumulation becomes deadly within days. Refugee camps, besieged cities, flood zone. These are the places where the ancient truth reasserts itself. Where waste goes determines who lives and who dies. The diseases that spread through fecal contamination, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, hepatitis, these remain among the leading killers in regions without adequate sanitation. The modern world has not eliminated these threats. It has simply displaced them, concentrated them in the places where systems are weakest, where poverty intersects with infrastructure neglect. There is also the question of what modern societies do with all that they collect. Treatment plants process waste into safer forms, but not perfectly. Pharmaceutical residues, microplastic, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. These flow through the systems and into waterways, soils, food chains. The ancient cycle that Chinese and Japanese farmers understood, the return of waste to the land, continues in industrial form. Biosolids spread on agricultural fields, effluent released into rivers and ocean. The loop remains closed, but at scales and with complexities that ancient engineers never imagined. Perhaps the deepest truth about waste is psychological. Every human being produces it, daily, inevitably. It is the most democratic of substances, shared across all cultures, all classes, all eras. And yet it generates shame, disgust, taboo. The effort civilizations expend to hide waste, to make it invisible, to pretend it does not exist, reveals something profound about the human relationship with the body, with mortality, with the inescapable animality that no amount of culture can entirely suppress. The toilet is not merely a sanitary device. It is a ritual object, a boundary marker, a machine for managing the psychological challenge of embodiment. The civilizations that succeeded in managing waste did not merely engineer plumbing, they engineered behavior. They created rituals of cleanliness. They assigned spaces for bodily functions and enforced their use. They built shame and privacy around natural processes, not because these emotions were natural, but because they served public health. The taboo against public defecation is not universal across human history. It had to be created, taught, enforced. It became so deeply embedded that modern people cannot imagine life without it. But the discomfort that surrounds the topic, the reluctance to discuss it, the euphemisms deployed to avoid direct mention, these are cultural artifacts, strategies for managing a perpetual challenge. The cities that failed, that were abandoned, that became mass graves, often failed for reasons related to waste. Civilizations do not usually collapse suddenly in dramatic catastrophe. They collapse quietly, through accumulating dysfunction, through systems that slowly fail to perform their essential function. Waste backs up, disease spreads, populations weaken. The slow unwinding happens beneath notice. in pipes and pits and neglected infrastructure, long before the visible symbols of civilization crumble. The fall of a city is often just the final acknowledgement of a collapse that began in its sewers. What remains when a civilization dies is often what it tried hardest to hide. Archaeologists sift through ancient latrines because these deposits preserve what ordinary refuse destroys: seeds, bones, parasites, traces of diet and disease. The waste pits tell the truth that monuments obscure. They reveal what people actually ate, how healthy they were, what pathogens circulated through their bodies. In death, civilizations confess through their garbage. The things they celebrated are long gone. What they discarded endures. Modern societies have built elaborate systems to ensure that their waste remains invisible. Treatment plants process millions of gallons daily. Trucks haul solid waste to distant landfills. Incinerators reduce mountains of refuse to ash. The labor is constant, expensive, and essential, but it is rarely discussed, rarely celebrated, rarely acknowledged as the foundation upon which urban life depends. The sanitation worker remains invisible, the infrastructure taken for granted, the entire system functioning only as long as water flows, power remains on, and labor shows up for shifts that offer little recognition and considerable risk. There is something worth considering in this arrangement. The most essential systems are often the least visible. The things that keep civilizations alive, that prevent the quiet collapse, that hold back disease and chaos, operate beneath notice. They are maintained by workers who rarely appear in histories, whose labor is compensated poorly and valued abstractly. The distance between survival and catastrophe is measured in functioning pipes, in trucks that arrive on schedule, in workers who descend into darkness to keep the flow moving. This has always been true. It will remain true, and societies that forget it, that allow these systems to decay while investing in more visible monuments, have historically learned the cost of that forgetting in ways that cannot be undone. What we bury, hide, or flush away often defines civilizations more than what they celebrate. The monuments crumble, the philosophies are forgotten, the wars become entries in textbooks no one reads. But the question of where the waste went, who moved it, how it was contained, whether the systems held or failed, these determined whether the civilization survived long enough to build monuments at all. This is not a comfortable truth. It is not a glorious truth, but it is a truth that whispers from every ancient latrine, every medieval cesspit, every aging pipe beneath every modern street. And it is a truth that continues, invisibly, to determine who lives and who does not.